Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon to introduce this webinar on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, titled Double Scammy. We'll find out exactly what Jonathon Porritt means by that as he makes his presentation. I just got a few things to say before we get running. First of all, a big thank you to our sponsors. We are very fortunate at the FS Club to have a range of sponsors who enable us to run this webinar program and to range widely over economics, finance, and other interesting topics. And the format for today is quite simple. My job is to introduce and then get out of the way so that we can hear from our keynote speaker, Jonathon Porritt. And we've got about a 20-minute presentation followed by some time for Q&A. Those of you who haven't used the GoToWebinar system before, the way to put a question to Jonathon is to type it into the question tab on the dashboard on your screen. They'll come to me and I'll field those towards the end of the session. And please do put your questions in at any point during the webinar as they come to you, and we'll pick those up as we go through. So without any further ado, really, just to introduce Jonathon Porritt, co-founder of the Forum for the Future, but with a very long history in thinking about sustainability and the way that the world needs to work. Jonathon, we're looking forward very much to your presentation, and really over to you for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for the invitation to take part in this series, which I am very glad to be able to do. Yes, it is a bit of an odd title, but what I will come to explain is that there are a lot of people out there, particularly in the world of NGOs, who think that bioenergy is something of a scam, and who also think that carbon capture and storage, CCS, is a bit of a scam. And from that perspective, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage becomes a double scam, as it were. I guess my task this afternoon is not to try and steer you one way or the other on that debate, but certainly to provide some of the background to this and to, I think, shed a bit of light on why we now face a very difficult situation in terms of our use of bioenergy. Oddly enough, this goes back quite a long way for me. I used to be chair of the Sustainable Development Commission between 2000 and 2008. And at about that time, I was one of many organizations invited by the government to the Labour government to a consultation about the possibility of converting Drax, which at that stage was, if not the, then certainly one of the largest coal-fired power stations anywhere in Europe, to convert Drax from burning coal to burning biomass. And this was a big play, a really big deal, as one of the fastest ways of getting rid of our dependence on coal, decarbonizing our electricity supply system. And it was thought at the time, maybe even setting a precedent that the rest of the world would want to follow. A lot of the groundwork was done around then. It was in 2012, in fact, that the Conservative and Lib Dems decided that they would definitely proceed with this support for Drax as it carried out its conversion, not of all its boilers in the first instance, but of 4 of the boilers. And by 2018, much of that conversion had been done. Actually, an extraordinary engineering project in itself, in many ways. So Drax stopped being the world's or Europe's largest coal-fired power station and became Europe's largest bioenergy power station, but biggest biomass burning power station, if you like. Of course, that was 2018. Even since 2018, a lot has changed. A lot of the ways we think about burning biomass to produce electricity and heat in well-designed plants has changed. The mood has swung very strongly against the idea of burning trees for energy in some parts of Europe and amongst many NGOs. So what was once seen, even by NGOs back in 2012, as a reasonable thing to try to do, to get out of coal as fast as we could. And if that meant getting out of coal into biomass, well, burning wood would be better than burning coal, surely. So even the NGOs were very cautiously supportive of this. 10 years on, 12 years on, they're not supportive very much at all. And indeed, there are many concerns that they now have about the burning of biomass in big power stations. And many of those concerns are now very influential inside the European Commission, where new regulations are currently being thrashed out as regards the degree to which the European Union will continue to support the idea of burning wood in power stations as a source of renewable electricity. Details not quite finalized, but there's no question that we won't see anything like the level of support that has existed over the last 10 years. So what has given rise to those concerns, basically, on the bioenergy end of it? I'll come on to the carbon capture and storage in the second half, but on the bioenergy bit, what's caused those concerns? Well, it's easiest just to think about this in terms of the different stages in the supply chain for a large biomass burning power station like the Selby plant, Drax's Selby plant in Yorkshire. First of all, you have to think about the forests themselves, and are they being managed responsibly and sustainably? Then you have to think about the supply chain. How do you get the raw material to the power station? And then thirdly, you have to think about, is that actually benefiting us from a decarbonization point of view? And that's essentially where those three chunks of discussion lie at the moment. About 15 months ago, I was approached as founder director of Forum for the Future to set up a high-level panel to carry out an inquiry into what it would take to persuade people that bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, acronym BECCS, what would it take to persuade people that BECCS can be done well, meeting the highest social, environmental, and climate criteria? So we set up that panel. We spent much of 2022 carrying out a detailed inquiry with expert witnesses and a huge literature search. Interestingly, not many of the NGOs wanted to play ball and didn't contribute in person or by organization to the inquiry. They contributed a huge amount of literature, of course. Our high-level panel was pretty persuaded that there is no reason why we shouldn't manage commercial forests in completely responsible and sustainable ways indefinitely. There are many examples around the world of commercial forests managed in this way. And as long as we're clear about which forests are for commercial purposes and which forests are basically for conservation, biodiversity, carbon purposes, then we should be able to manage that. In terms of the supply chain, Drax has made things a little bit more difficult for itself because it's uneconomic to ship huge amounts of chips, the biomass in the form of chips, to the UK because they take up so much volume. So they invested in a new generation of pellet making plants, the process of pelletization, where you take all your feedstocks and you convert them into pellets, which are then shipped to the UK. And Drax sources primarily from the southeastern states of the USA, Mississippi, Louisiana, etc., and from British Columbia. There's not enough biomass here in the UK to feed the monster that is Drax. It is a huge, huge power station. And I thought I'd just give you a visual representation as a backdrop to this, just to remind people how absolutely enormous this power station really is. So for this conversion from coal to biomass to work, you would have to source pellets from abroad. And southeastern USA and British Columbia are by far the easiest places for Drax to go. Scandinavia uses almost all its own biomass for its own purposes. So it's possible to have a supply chain that is responsibly and sustainably managed. You need complex life cycle analysis, assessments to work out exactly what the carbon footprint of an operation like that might be. Interestingly enough, shipping the stuff from America or Canada to the UK is, yeah, it's a small part, but it's a significant part of the total carbon footprint, but that's not really the issue. So it's possible to do that. And we created lots of conditions which we felt would need to be met for that part of the BECCS supply chain to be done well. And then thirdly, and most controversially of all, should we be burning trees at all, even if they are sourced responsibly and manufactured and shipped responsibly? Should we be using it at all? And the reason why things have changed so much in the last decade is that people have got a much clearer sense now of the problem associated with burning biomass rather than much denser fuels such as coal or gas, those hydrocarbon fuels. And the problem is that you need a lot more biomass-based feedstocks to create the same amount of energy. Of course, when you burn biomass, CO2 emissions are also released into the atmosphere. But using the methodology established by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Drax was quite properly allowed to describe this as a carbon neutral process. That's in the rules accepted by governments all around the world. And of course, the reason for it being carbon neutral is that the emissions are put into the atmosphere, and then with new forest growth, those CO2 emissions are taken up by the new trees as they become part of a well-managed commercial forest. So you've got a closed loop system. True, but not enough for the NGOs, because they have rightly said, we're in a climate emergency. It takes a lot of time to sequester all of that CO2 that your emissions from Selby are causing up there in the atmosphere. And we haven't got a lot of time. We're being told now that we have to halve emissions of CO2 by 2030, or whatever the date might be now. We have to move at speed in ways that people haven't properly taken account of. So the fact that over the cycle of a forest, the process of burning wood to create electricity can be seen as carbon neutral, it depends how long it takes. And this is the difference between the southeastern states in the USA, where you have a harvest cycle of around 30 years. They're fast growing like they are in other parts of the country, of the world. And the difference between that and British Columbia, where you have a forest cycle of probably closer to 70, 80 years. And if it takes 70 to 80 years to sequester all the CO2 that has been emitted from burning some of the biomass from those forests, you can see that this problem, what is called carbon debt, is a really big problem. The inquiry, our high-level panel, we said this is a big deal. It has to be thought through really, really carefully so that we can come up with some proper answers to that. So, challenge one, bioenergy is not a scam. It is problematic. It may not be giving us as big a decarbonization benefit as we like to think, but it's not a scam and it can be done well. So then we move quickly to the second part of this, which is carbon capture and storage, because some time ago, the Drax board decided that it could see some of these problems coming down the track. And what it really needed to do was to retrofit this huge plant, you can see at Selby, so that the boilers that are burning biomass would be equipped with a new bit of technology, a very large carbon capture and storage plant to strip out all the CO2 from the flue gases from burning the biomass, to compress those gases, those CO2 gases, in a form that could then be shipped eventually, or piped from the Selby plant to the coast, and from the coast it would then be injected into spent oil and gas reservoirs in the North Sea. Very much a first of a kind technology, a huge investment, £2 billion investment, very little experience of what sequestration looks like in the North Sea at that scale, but those would all be the issues that would have to be solved. So that's now a second challenge, if you like, which is carbon capture and storage. And there is a long and difficult history for this technology all around the world. We've known about CCS for at least 20 or more years. There have been a lot of investments in CCS plants, usually attached to power plants that are burning coal or gas. And the idea was to capture the CO2 emissions from that and then use those captured CO2 emissions for what is called enhanced oil recovery, injecting them back into active reservoirs to squeeze out more oil or gas than might otherwise be the case. And most of the operating CCS plants in the world today have been using the sales of CO2, if you like, for enhanced oil recovery as the economic justification. Everybody recognizes that this is crazy at a time when we're trying to reduce our total dependence on oil or gas. To find a way of allowing us to extend the lifetime of some of these assets is really totally counterintuitive. And Drax recognizes this. It's made a commitment that all the CO2 which will be captured from its plant at Selby will not be used for enhanced oil recovery. It will be sequestered on a semi-permanent or near permanent basis in spent oil and gas reservoirs or saline aquifers, wherever it might be. So that's the second part of the equation. I'm hugely skeptical about carbon capture and storage attached to hydrocarbon thermal plants, to coal or oil or gas. It's clearly just a way of extending the lifetime of those assets, and in my opinion, totally unjustified. But it is really interesting to think about CCS on a bioenergy plant, because if you can do this cost effectively, and you can sequester with a 95% capture rate, which is the target that Drax has set itself, and you can then transport that gas, that compressed gas, to these reservoirs in the North Sea and take those millions of tons of CO2 out of the atmospheric system, then you have a pretty good example of what is now described as carbon removals, taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And if Drax can do this at Selby, it will certainly be a first of a kind. It'll be a massive contribution to this country's quite ambitious target for carbon removals, and it will set a model for many other parts of the world, particularly in the United States, which, and this is my last comment, the United States is now investing very ambitiously in prospects for BECCS. The Inflation Reduction Act, as many of you will probably know, has increased the level of subsidy for all companies, but mostly fossil fuel companies, but not only, for companies that wish to invest now in new BECCS assets, as long as they can get those commitments made and the plans approved by 2025. And the subsidy is nearly doubled. So there'll be a lot of new investment in BECCS over the course of the next 10 years. And we have to hope that by putting the BECCS plant in the forest, rather than taking the proceeds of the forest, the raw material of the forest, to a BECCS plant, as happens with Drax at the moment, that we'll see much more carbon efficiency than we have at the moment. So this is a huge area of new investment. Hundreds of millions of dollars will flow into new BECCS plants over the next few years. And we have to hope that this will really begin to deliver some very substantive carbon removal benefits. So personally, I don't believe that CCS on bioenergy is a scam. I'm pretty convinced that CCS on all thermal hydrocarbon-based plants is an out-and-out scam. I'll pause there, Mike, because that's quite a lot of stuff, and hopefully that'll have got one or two thoughts and ideas going for discussion.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a brilliant sort of tour of the history of how we got to where we are. I've got a few comments have come in. Jeff Sussman asks, you mentioned that biomass doesn't have the same level of support going forward that it did over the past 10 years when this technology was being delivered. And obviously political and popular support may well have lessened, but has there also been a decrease in financial support? In other words, are there still subsidies running towards BECCS? And what do you think the future is of this technology?
Well, there are still subsidies in both the UK and in the European Union. Both have made it clear that subsidies for let's call it a standard bioenergy plant, so just to produce renewable electricity and renewable heat, but those subsidies will be ratcheted down. And the UK's made that pretty clear already. We actually have the final detail what that would look like. And in the EU, they're currently negotiating that, but it will definitely see a downward rate of financial support for that. That's what has opened up the space for government support for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is a very different kind of support, which is what Drax, of course, is arguing as eloquently as it can, because that is not so much about the dispatchable renewable electricity it will produce, which probably shouldn't be subsidized for much longer anyway. It's not so much about that as it is about the first of what will probably be several removals plants here in the UK and many removals plants in the EU, let alone in America, as I just mentioned. So the position is pretty clear this side of the Atlantic, that the support will now move away from unabated bioenergy into the CCS side of bioenergy. And in the United States, it's already clear through the Inflation Reduction Act that that's what they want to put their dollars into as well. Okay.
Mark Cook's noted that there are plans to ban wood-burning stoves in London. The concentration there is not just on CO2, but other noxious emissions, whether it's nitrous oxide or sodium oxide, whatever. And just wondering how, therefore, the argument runs you can release some of those other noxious gases on an industrial scale if we're thinking of closing down wood-burning stoves for domestic purposes.
Yes, happily, you can't. The Drax plant is very strictly regulated in terms of emissions of all of those pollutants. And it has to be regulated like that because it is a genuine massive problem. So even if you capture all the CO2, you still got to have the plant managed to capture those other gases. That is absolutely crucial. I mean, that is one of the issues about a CCS plant, that it's quite problematic sticking a big CCS plant on a big biomass power station. It takes a lot of energy to actually provide for a CCS plant of that kind. I'm not quite sure what the final figure will be, but depending on what technology and what configuration you're talking about, a CCS plant can take as much as 25 to 40% of the energy generated by a power plant. And that's called parasitic energy, because it's literally just taking that energy in order to make the CCS plant work. It's a very energy intensive business. So you've got to overcome that. What it would mean for the Selby plant, of course, is that there would be less dispatchable electricity for the grid, because more of its own electricity would be needed for the CCS plant itself.
Thank you very much. Katie Smarts asked how we can improve, do we need to improve sustainability standards so that biodiversity and carbon accounting are included in the costs of BECCS? I mean, have we got it right yet in terms of the way that we measure?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a crucial part of the whole picture. And our inquiry actually spent a great deal of time looking at fitness for purpose for those standards. Are they actually giving both the businesses involved and consumers and regulators the assurance they need that these products are coming to market in a way that doesn't damage biodiversity, harm water quality, soil quality, affect local communities damagingly, etc., etc. There are a number of different standards which are already applied by Drax, both in terms of support for forest management, things like Forestry Stewardship Council, support for ensuring that the biomass is then converted in the right way into pellets to be burnt in the power station. And there's an organization called the Sustainable Biomass Program that promulgates a very detailed standard as to the sustainability of the feedstocks that are being used. And then depending on which part of the world you're talking about, there are all sorts of local ordinances, if you like, local regulations, which can sometimes be extremely strict, sometimes less strict, as you would expect. But getting the standards right is critical from Drax's point of view. It can't build trust with consumers here in the UK, let alone with the government, if it isn't able to deliver these benefits in a way that would meet the expectations of every stakeholder from a regulatory and standards point of view.
Thank you very much. Two linked questions. Christine Brentani has asked, is there a physical limit to how much carbon we can store? And John Knight's asking the specific, I mean, for how many years can Drax carry out carbon capture by injecting into spent oil and gas fields? I mean, there must be a physical limit at some point.
Yeah, yes, there is. I mean, these are questions for the future, but they do already loom large. When you're thinking about an investment of £2 billion, you're thinking about an asset which will need to last for a long time to recoup the investment on that. And when you're thinking about it from a kind of climate point of view, we need that CO2 to stay down there for thousands of years. So one of the biggest issues about this whole notion of carbon capture and storage is the regulatory conditions under which the CO2 will actually be transported and stored. There are many complex liability issues still to be worked out in that regard, which governments have been a bit dilatory in actually getting their heads around, because once you've stored it away there, who bears responsibility if the CO2 doesn't stay there? If there's some kind of fissure or crack or whatever might happen, and suddenly what seems like a safe vault, if you like, for our CO2 suddenly is cracked open, and that CO2 escapes back into the atmosphere. So right now, all around the world, geologists and scientists are looking at what is the capacity for storing captured CO2, and what should the regime be for assuring taxpayers in particular that these disposal sites, spent oil and gas reservoirs and saline aquifers in particular, will perform in a way that meets the needs that we have. I'm not an expert and not a geologist here, so the second question is going to be beyond my reach. But all I can tell you is that from what I hear, because of the very heavy usage of North Sea assets over the last 50 years or so, that there is an absolutely huge amount of room, space, if you like, for sequestering the CO2 that we create. But obviously, if you really push this argument to the nth degree, and we carried on putting 40 billion tons or thereabouts of CO2 into the atmosphere, and in order to have a safe climate for people in the future, we'd have to take 40 billion tons back out of the atmosphere. Obviously, there are going to be limits. So this just reminds people that the absolute top priority now, before we get overexcited about carbon removals, is to stop putting the bloody stuff up there and actually to do the right job from decarbonizing our economy now, so that we have less of a problem to deal with in the future.
Thank you. Mark Cook asked a question which he then says he thought was probably answered, but it may be worth running around it again. It's asking the question why we don't burn UK commercial forests, as they're non-indigenous species, therefore they don't particularly help wildlife biodiversity. And obviously there's a question of just the amount of available material we have. But is that also true across Europe?
Yes, it's what I was commenting on earlier was the volume of material needed by Drax. It imports millions of tons every year of pellets from the USA and from Canada. And although we have a reasonably large lumber industry here in the UK, it would not be able to accommodate that level of demand. It's also, of course, providing for a lot of timber needs at the moment. That lumber goes into construction and furniture and many other industries today. And one would hope that those uses will remain commercially viable. Our UK sector is tiny in comparison to other European countries. And for those other European countries, it's possible to think about using some of their timber, their woody biomass, if you like, for purposes of providing for energy, biofuels or bioenergy, because they've got such huge forests. So I mentioned Scandinavia. Much of Scandinavian wood timber already goes into Swedish or Danish or Finnish kind of businesses that provide for their own needs in this area. And I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think when Drax looked at sourcing from Scandinavia, which would obviously be very convenient from the point of view of it's a damn sight closer to the east coast of the UK than it is to British Columbia or to the southeastern states of the USA, that the cost of importing from Scandinavia would be very, very high indeed, because they use so much of it domestically. Other European countries have huge forests. There's a lot of talk now about what are the prospects for BECCS in other European countries. Because of NGO skepticism about some of this, I suspect that will be a slower route to market than will be the case in the USA, where essentially the debate looks a little bit different. And they've got huge amounts of forests. I mean, the forests in the southeast of the USA are absolutely vast. And they've been used as commercial timber for more than 100 years. So there's no question. I don't think there's very much old growth or primary forest left in the southern states of the US. And of course, they're also very interested in the US now of using some of their diseased wood in order to prevent some of the wildfires that they've been getting so damagingly over the last few years. So I think it'll go forward there faster than it does in Europe.
Thank you. Katie Smart's got a second question, but just wondering how we can invest in BECCS with public money before we know it works. Aren't we just actually subsidising Drax through millions in subsidies without actually sequestering any carbon at all? And is that a sensible use of public finance?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And that's exactly what I think government ministers are wrestling with at the moment. So you probably heard that the UK government made its announcement about the first tier of support for companies that want to push forward with carbon capture and storage investments. And they're called the tier 1 companies, which will get a significant share of the 200 million that the UK government has committed to support CCS in this country. Drax was not included in that first tier. That's partly because it's such a big scheme, and partly because it's coming at it from a different point of view. It's trying to do this from the perspective of carbon removals, which the government as yet has not fully thought through as a strategic priority. So you're putting your finger on a really difficult issue, because in order to do this at Drax, you've got to go to scale in one fell swoop. You can't kind of do a small plant. You need to have a big plant, first of a kind plant of this kind. Hence the very high asking price, if you like, 2 billion. Now, the government wouldn't be providing all of that money. Most of the money will come from private investors, but the government will be asked for a significant level of support. It's not like subsidy support for electricity delivered into the grid, which Drax gets today, as does every other producer of renewable electricity. It's not like that. This will be a different subsidy regime for tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And one of the recommendations in our report, I don't know how Drax will respond to this one, we'll have to see, but one of the recommendations in our report was that no government subsidies should be paid for tons of CO2 sequestered until that CO2 was in the North Sea, buried in those old reservoirs. So retrospective payment for tons delivered, rather than huge sums of money up front to, as you say, create a risky venture in the minds of some.
Thank you. Christopher Beadle, coming back to the whole question of the debt being built up by the fact that forests take an awful long time to grow. He just notes that the EU Commission's own Joint Research Centre has stated that burning forest biomass is not carbon neutral because it emits carbon, while forests needs decades, if not centuries, to regrow. Thus, trusted carbon neutrality can't really happen from burning wood pellets, he argues. If the emissions and reduction of biodiversity services are not accounted for from that deforestation. Could you share a bit more of your thinking on, on how this fits together and how we calculate carbon neutrality in this way?
Yeah, there is a huge methodological problem here, which is when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change determined how to account for the emissions from burning biomass or from biofuels. It allowed for the fact that all of those emissions would be reabsorbed, sequestered by new forest growth. And the whole IPCC process is based on that old methodology, which has not changed. And it drives the NGOs mad because, lots of people are pointing out, as the question again has repeated, to call that carbon neutral when you've got such an extended debt, sometimes up to 80 years, is problematic, genuinely problematic. Now, that means revisiting the IPCC rules, and that's not something Drax can do. It's not something the UK government could unilaterally do on its own anyway, but boy, there does have to be some process to shake this up. Just a question about the use of the word deforestation there. I mean, Drax is not deforesting anything, because what Drax is doing is taking its raw material, its woody biomass, from two different sources. One, what are called forest wastes. So that's all the bark and the sawdust from the sawmills that operate throughout these areas. And secondly, it's taking woody biomass from non-commercially viable raw material in the forest, by which they usually mean the big branches, the tops of trees, because obviously they're all cut off quite low down. All those trees that are deformed, they don't grow straight, diseased trees, and what are called thinnings. And in a commercially managed forest, before that forest comes to maturity, the operators will take significant volumes of wood, small round wood as it's called, out of the forest because it's not sufficiently valuable to them, and it won't grow to become big mature trees of the kind that they need. So Drax got itself into a lot of problems by saying that we don't use whole trees. Well, actually, as we have said to them, that's not technically true. A thinned tree is still a whole tree, but it's not a tree that has much value to anybody because it doesn't go any longer to make pulp, because all the pulp mills have closed down in that part of the world. So in fact, you're providing additional value for the forest owners in those parts of the world. But it's still a whole tree. However, Drax is not responsible for managing the total forest, and it's certainly not responsible for any of the deforestation.
Thanks very much. We've got a couple of linked questions, one from Angel Gaviero, one from Donald McRae, saying that it's unquestionable for energy security, we still need to burn hydrocarbons for a moment, for a time until renewables can replace the energy. How can carbon capture and storage not be helpful for the former and make a difference in the carbon budget if they commit to not prolonging brown asset lives for that length of time? And Donald Craig says, is there a justification for using carbon capture and storage on gas and oil as a short-term transition measure in the decarbonising journey?
Well, guess what? That's what a lot of people in the fossil fuel companies say, that we're going to go on burning these hydrocarbons for quite some time to come. And wouldn't it be better if we could abate those emissions by capturing the CO2 and burying them in those saline aquifers or deposits and so on? Well, there are so many things to say about this. Firstly, we need to get out of those fossil fuels as fast as you can imagine. And don't forget, this is not me talking. This is now the IPCC, the Secretary General of the United Nations, every responsible energy expert in the world, including the International Energy Agency, which is no patsy when it comes to saying some tough stuff about the global energy economy. We have to get out of them fast. And the trouble is, if you make very expensive additional investments in keeping those coal and gas assets going for longer than they should be continued with, then what we're doing is just postponing the day when we make that full transition. And for me, it's very, very clear now that the oil and gas industry are basically using this as a form of predatory delay. They're just trying to delay the day before their fossil fuel assets must die, and before governments accept that we can't build any new fossil fuel assets. That day will come. But CCS is problematic in that regard because it extends the life of something that basically ought to be wound down as fast as possible.
We're very nearly out of time, Jonathan, but I'm going to squeeze in a couple more questions if I can. First of all, Clive Bullins asks, are there better alternatives for energy sources than carbon capture? And Martin White adds, he's heard in the past talk about clean burn power generation. In other words, are there still other technical developments that are on the way that might do even better than BECCS?
There's a lot in the pipelines, they say. And I hope we will see some significant shifts. Hydrogen is often discussed here as a critical additional energy carrier, which will help enormously with transport fuels, shipping, for instance. Some talk about it as being useful for aviation. Some say it'll be an absolutely critical fuel to help decarbonize our steel sector. Very interesting report just published by the Energy Transitions Commission showing how quickly we could start burning using hydrogen rather than coking coal to create green steel for the future. So there's a huge amount of innovation going on in this space at the moment. And a lot of it is extraordinarily encouraging. Things are moving very, very fast. But the thing that's moving fastest of all is new investment in renewables. Yep. In offshore wind in particular, onshore, in solar, in other renewable energy systems, which are just continuing to outperform on every front.
And a very last comment, really, rather than a question. Elizabeth Wrigley said, it looks as though seagrass, kelp, and good old peat would be as good at storing CO2 for a few millennia as any other system. Should we be investing in additional biomass, I guess? Yes,
it was wonderful to hear David Attenborough give a plug for the UK's amazing seagrasses and kelp beds, because they do indeed sequester CO2 faster than trees, and they could be an amazing part both of restoring our biodiversity and of doing this business of natural sequestration of CO2. So yep. Removing CO2 from the atmosphere via all these wonderful natural systems that need to be regenerated and restored.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. It's been a rush around, a really, really important topic. But really many thanks for your presentation and the discussion. I've got a few thank yous to say. First of all, again, just a brief thank you to our sponsors who enable this webinar series. And talking about hydrogen, we do have a session coming up towards the end of April where we'll be focusing on hydrogen and bringing together experts from China and Europe to talk about the future of hydrogen. But between now and then, we've got other events coming up. On Monday, the Science of Aging Well, a session from Mauritius looking at its place as a fintech hub on Tuesday, and then next Thursday launching the 11th edition of the Global Green Finance Index, which we're looking forward to. So do keep an eye out on our website for forthcoming events, and we look forward to seeing you again. And finally, Jonathon, normally I'd lay the floor open and we'd have a round of applause and all that. We can't do that over on a webinar, but my thanks to you, and on behalf of the audience, my thanks to you for being with us this afternoon. It's been a fascinating session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to join you. Thanks.